This podcast is brought to you by Startup Socials, a global community of entrepreneurs built to connect and empower people in the startup ecosystem.
Welcome everybody to yet another Startup Socials podcast. I'm your host, Igor Shaifot. Today, we have quite a wonderful guest. I heard a lot about him, and I'm sure or at least many of you, heard about Steve Hoffman. He is with the Founder Space. He's the captain of Founder Space, and he is lots of other things from what I hear. Please tell us in a few words about your captainness.
Sure. Captain is my handle, my nickname. I'm a gamer. So I go under Captain Hoff, but I'm also the founder of Founder Space. And we're an accelerator and incubator here in San Francisco.
So I heard a lot of other good things about you. I heard that you help a lot of different startups, and I heard that you're one of, well, I want to say one of many people, but one of very few really exciting people to know stuff about startups. So I'm going to start with a tricky question, which is, what is your, or if you're more brave, or somebody else's if you're less brave, most favorite screw up or most favorite fuck up if we are not a PG-13?
So my most favorite screw up that I did myself, because I've done too many to actually choose whichever you want, or you can talk about somebody else's, but I think it would be much cooler if you would talk about your own. Yeah, I'll talk about myself. So my worst screw up ever was I had two pretty bad screw ups. So my worst screw up ever was when I was offered tens of millions of dollars to sell my startup in the dot-com boom. You remember the dot-com boom? It's sort of like now. We're having a redux of that. But during the dot-com boom, I was offered a lot of money to sell my startup. I owned most of the startup because it hadn't been diluted. We had only taken one round of funding. And I passed it up only to discover 6 months later that the boom was over and it was bust time. So that was my worst screw up. But it was a beginner's mistake.
Sorry to hear that. What would you recommend to startuppers? There were many situations when people were offered lots of money and they said yes or they said no. Not so famously at some point, but a lot of people know that Mark Zuckerberg was offered $1 billion by Yahoo. And a lot of people, including myself, said he's such an idiot not to sell a hugely money-burning startup. What would you recommend? Go ahead, sorry.
Yes, I said the same thing after not selling my startup, only to be proven wrong by Mark Zuckerberg. So
maybe words of wisdom to people like you and me, or to the future Mark Zuckerbergs? I
do. And it's very hard to time markets, as we all know. We all believe passionately in our startups. I did. I was like, we were the #1 in our sector at the time, and a public company was coming to buy us out. And we thought, well, we could grow much more. And also, our venture capitalists who were on board told us, don't sell at that valuation. You're worth triple that or double that at least. So it was my first startup. And I made that choice, and then I lived with the results. It's very hard to know, a bird in the hand worth a bird in the bush. So what I tell startups to do is say, do you have a real business? Like, if the economy were to change overnight, would you still be in business, or would you have to shut down? So that is the fundamental question. And I should have known that, our business, our customers, we were an interactive television play, and all of our customers were the big TV networks, and they totally cut their budgets after the dot-com bust for anything interactive, anything and everything. And there was no ad market at the time to support us. So the answer was we could not survive during a down cycle. So if you're a startup now and you're getting an offer that's really good money for you, like if you're independently wealthy, it doesn't matter. But if it's really good money for you that you could retire by, even if you're in your 20s. And your business, if there's a bust, won't keep going, it can't sustain itself, then I would say you should seriously consider that offer. I mean, nobody, it's always a tough choice, but like I had a startup in founder space who received, you know, a $40 million or higher. They said they would go higher. The original was $40 million offer. The guy owned the entire company virtually himself. He just had a few angels in there. Now, naturally, I told him, you probably should take that money. But he, again, did the same thing I did, and he chose not to take it. So time will tell whether he made the right choice.
Yeah, good point. My second question, I think, is quite expected. So lots of people are talking about founder space. A lot of my different friends told me that I should check it out, etc. And, you know, congratulations. There are lots of great startups there. What sets you guys apart?
So what sets us apart? I mean, there are a lot of incubators and accelerators out there, as you know. We have, our niche has really been in the flexibility of our program. So when I started Founder Space, I just didn't want to copy the Y Combinator model or the 500 startups model or Techstars. They all do roughly 3 months of acceleration, sometimes 4, culminating in a demo day. So I was already engaged with startups. I'd done a bunch of startups myself, some better than others, as I just described. And the first thing I did is what I tell all of my startups to do. I was, you know, whenever they come to me with a problem, they're like, Steve, what do I do? Do I do this or do I do that? I'm so confused. And I say, I don't know. Go ask your customer. Ask your customers what you should do and come back, and then we'll talk about your strategy. So we can't just make it up out of thin air. So I sort of practiced what I preached. And I went out and I started talking to startup founders and asking them problems they had. I said, you know, all these accelerators are really good. You know, Y Combinator, they're excellent. You get a great value there. But what are you missing? What would you do differently? And I heard a couple themes in that from startups, just recurring themes. And I talked to, you know, hundreds of startups because I was already doing these roundtables all around the world with startups. And the number one thing they said was, especially startups coming from overseas, but also even startups here in the US, you know, whether they're coming from New York or they're even in the Bay Area, they were like, you know, being tied up in an accelerator for 3 months where we meet 1 or 2 days a week is really difficult for us, because especially the ones who had teams that were remote. Maybe their team was back in Texas or back in New York or New Delhi or Japan or wherever. They said it's really hard to be away for 3 months. You know, a lot of our startups are from Asia and Europe, and they're like, I have to, you know, I can't, you know, for 3 months I'm trapped in the US. I can't leave the Bay Area or else I'll miss out on the program. And meanwhile, I have customers back home. I have a lot of times they're family members back home. And most importantly, you know, well, not most importantly, but importantly, employees who they need to manage. So they said, can you condense the program and give us the same amount of education I get in a 3-month program in 30 days? So that we thought that was easy. And so we run a 30-day program, but it's super intense. It's like every single day we have multiple mentoring sessions and lessons and different, you know, venture capitalists and other people coming in to meet with the startups. So for 30 days, it's like a super crash course. And then we have our demo day. And that allows startups much more flexibility. And then go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
You know, it's a long answer to a short question. So that was the number one thing they wanted. The number two thing that startups founders told me was that a lot of them were here on 3-month visas because that's what they got when they came over here. And so having a demo day at the very end of a 3-month program was tough because they'd meet with all the investors and everything, and then they'd be kicked out of the country. They'd have to leave, whether they wanted to stay and follow up or not. And that posed a real problem because most, as you know, being a Silicon Valley person, most of the investors here are like, oh, you're out of the country now? Well, you know, I need to do diligence. Well, call me when you get back. And they're like, no, can we do a Skype call? Can you invest? And they're like, you know, they lose interest really quickly. Everybody's pretty fickle. So they would be like, you know, the entrepreneur would end up coming back 3 months later or so. And then the investor wouldn't even know, you know, remember who they were. Oh, that demo day long ago, haven't you been funded yet? So that became, so the other thing by moving the demo day up after 1 month instead of 3 months is allow those who are on a shorter visa to actually follow up with all their investors right immediately after. And then if they have to bounce back and forth between their home country or city and the Bay Area, they could do it more flexibly. Then the final thing that I heard was a lot of founders had issues because they would go through a typical accelerator program, and at the end of 3 months, there would be the demo day, and then they would be on their own. Literally, after demo day, they would be on their own, and a new batch of startups would come into the accelerator. But they would have, a lot of times they said, we had more questions after demo day than before, because demo day, you know, demo day is one thing, and we couldn't think of all the different things that investors would ask us until we fully engaged with them. And then they got all these questions. And as you know, businesses evolve and change, and they wanted to go back to the mentoring network. They wanted to go back in the program after demo day. So again, we kind of restructured it. So we do that very compressed program in the month up front, have demo day, but then we keep allowing our startup founders to come back whenever we have mentoring sessions and workshops to engage with founder space for a whole year, so that they aren't left, you know, if they pivot or iterate or, you know, run into, you know, there's countless situations that they run into, then they have a resource to fall back on.
Makes lots of sense. Thanks very much. And it really covers lots of interesting things. And I think it's hopefully helpful not only to people considering your accelerator, but also to startups in general who are, I hope, are quite aware of the whole process and of all the little things that happen on the way to hopefully the big things. I heard another thing about you, that you guys are among the most international accelerators. Is that true?
That is true. So we are very internationally focused, although not exclusively. So 40% of our startups are from the United States. So, but the other 60% are abroad, and that wow. has been a natural occurrence because of the way we structured our program, because of the flexibility we give our startups and the longer term support that they need, especially if they're international and they're going back and forth. It usually takes longer for them to get funded. They come here and they go and they come back. So, and then they also have issues about setting up their team here, and we help them with that. You know, visa issues, all these things that are particular to international startups, we help them with that. So because of that, we just naturally attract more startups from overseas.
Thank you, Steve. And another question that I have, having read about you and right now listening to you, you definitely are a person not just experienced in the whole entrepreneurship, but you're one of those people who sort of sit not in the restaurant, but rather in the kitchen of the startup. So you don't see all the, you know, lovely shining press releases and great videos, but actually all the dirt happening in the kitchen with all the bad things happening. So a question to you then, what is a sign of a startup that is going to screw up? What is a sign, an early sign of a startup that is not going well?
Okay, I have that's a good one. So there are a lot of signs of startups that are going to screw up, and the most telling one is, you know, when a startup doesn't have a technical co-founder on board, we in general, but not always, won't even take them, because without a technical co-founder, it's almost always they hit a point where they've outsourced their development and they run out of money and everything just grinds to a halt. And the startup, it just can't progress, and they're in desperate shape, and it just falls apart. The other thing is when a technical co-founder leaves a startup, that's a sure sign that there's a real problem. not just because a core team member, co-founder has left, but also because now they don't have a technical co-founder. And I've seen that happen with startups, before. So the most important, I would say a critical thing is that what I always tell startups is that your co-founder can't be somebody you hired. They can't be even a full-time employee, let alone a contractor, which so many startups hire contractors. They outsource all their development because it's not okay to create a good product. We don't want startups with good products because there are a billion good products out there, and they're only great products break through. You know how competitive it is, on your phone with an app. You'll just you delete those apps right and left. And the ones that are good, even though they're good enough, they're not good enough because they never break through and capture the market. It's only the truly excellent products. And I don't think you can create an excellent product when you're hiring, especially contractors who are paid by the hour, who when the next deal comes along, a better pay, they're going to jump on it. They're usually managing 3 or 4 clients at once because that's what you have to do as a contractor. And they aren't focused on thinking about that product day and night. Like you have to create a breakthrough product. You have to be dreaming of it. You have to wake up in the middle of the night with new ideas. You have to work whatever hours it takes to get that product over the hump. And when things don't go right, you have to be there for that product. When you hire somebody, they just are, especially in the early stages where products require so much iteration and so much testing and so much thinking and careful analysis. If your lead engineers aren't fully vested in your company, that's a huge red flag that this company is probably not going to make it.
Lenke, I think it's a really excellent question. To all of you guys listening and watching, I really would recommend taking this to heart. One important thing to me who's a shareholder in dozens of different startups, a question to a fellow investor and shareholder in many other startups, I'm sure. Do you really think startups need investors? I'm not necessarily saying they do or they don't. Would you argue that all of them should look for investment money, or some? Would you argue that they need to seriously think about whether to take an investment or not, or rather that everybody needs an investment? What's your general take on this dichotomy of, on the one hand, startuppers, this starry-eyed, very romantic, so to say, people, brave and hoping to conquer the world and taking the huge risks, and quite frankly, rather cynical investors who are not really necessarily in love with the stuff they're investing in, or just looking at a bunch of different possibilities and are saying, look, I think the ROI would be higher here. What's your take on this world? Investors, startuppers?
Yeah, these are great questions because it gets to the heart of what we're seeing in Silicon Valley. So people are coming here with their startups to live the dream. And part of the dream, as we all know, is that the streets are paved with venture dollars. And you could just pick them up in a wheelbarrow and get funded when you come to Silicon Valley. We all know that isn't the case. And the bigger problem is that shouldn't be the goal. Like the goal of a great startup should be to build a business, a real business. And the investment money, usually the smart money follows definite signs that this is, if you are able to walk into investors and prove to them that you have a real business, they will fund you every time. And it's a big business. It's going to be a big multi-billion-dollar business. They will fund you every time. What we see is I see a lot of startups coming to me and saying, their end goal is just to get investment. They're like, how do I get investment? And they put a huge amount of time into going out and fundraising at the expense of focusing on their core business. A lot of times they have an idea of what their business is. They've assembled a team and they may even have a product, but they haven't actually proven that there's really a business there. And I always tell them, it is better for you to spend your time proving to yourself, because you don't want to be wasting your time raising money only to find out you raised some money from some person who isn't as smart and doesn't require a high level of proof and is willing to just take a bet on you.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I like the pause that you took before saying from some person who you really wanted to say something else, but
yeah, some idiot,
yeah.
No, but there are a lot of people who will just bet on like the shiny object, but they won't really demand and look under the hood, right? If the car looks beautiful, it's a great paint job, but is the engine even working? They want you. You want to be able to take your investors in a test drive. And that means having an engine that you have some proof actually runs around the block and does what you say it does. So I actually discourage startups from focusing too much energy on investors until they actually can make a business case. And by a business case, I don't mean you have to have traction out the gazoo, all these, your engagement levels are off the charts and you have millions of users, or you have all this money coming in and big corporate customers. You don't have to have that to prove to investors. You can actually model an investment. With enterprise, it's really easy. You go out and talk to the customers and even get them to sign and put down a tiny bit of money for a payment in advance. That can prove there's a real market here for the solution or the product you have. For consumers, put out your MVP and at least, measure user engagement. It doesn't have to be millions of users, it can be thousands, but give us some idea of how you're gonna, what you're saying is real. And you're far better off doing that than spending countless hours raising capital only to discover perhaps the same thing, and at the end of the day, having spent a lot of some other person's money.
And I would say also that the investor side of that is that the more experienced you are in investing in startups, the more you realize that there are startups and there are startups. And the first kind of startups are really just some of the people that since you're dealing with earlier startups than I do as a VC, are typically, very often, not always, but very often guys who are really great, who have awesome idea, who really just out there working hard, etc., but they're not quite certain as to, what the positioning is, what the product will be, what the distribution channels are, how they're competing with the competition, what their competitive, blah, 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 this long thing. And they're basically saying, give us the money, give us the money to play our games, and then if we're lucky, you'll be lucky. So quite frankly, as an investor, the more you invest, the more you deal with startuppers, the more you realize that you don't want to invest in startups, but you want to invest in startups. And the startups you want to invest in are the same great people in a group of startups, but really startups, the people who already played, who already wasted time, who already screwed up, who already figured stuff out, right?
Yeah, that's what we want to invest in. I mean, who wants to take, put your money down on a roulette wheel, right? Yeah, it looks great. I'll put it all on number 5 and spin it and see if I end up with a Google. You'd rather have better odds than that. So as an investor, I want them to prove to me that there's a real business. And one of the big red flags, it's so simple with startups that I interview for investment like you, and you mentioned it just now, competitors. Like I'll go, even if they have that competitive chart, I'll go deep on like, have you used their products? What about your product is better than theirs? How exactly, why would a consumer switch from them to you? And if they say, if they don't know the answers to those, if they haven't extensively used the competition's products and services, and they don't understand exactly and are able to articulate to me as an investor why and how they're different in such a compelling enough way that a customer would actually bother to switch, because we all know customers have huge amounts of inertia once they're using something. Nobody wants to switch. I don't ever want to switch. So, but if they can show that and demonstrate that to me very clearly, that's a great sign. And that doesn't even require any traction. It just requires some time of theirs. So I don't want you running out to investors, asking them for money before you've at least done that.
Yeah.
At the very least.
So speaking of startuppers and investors, the question that I'm sure you are asked a lot, but maybe not, but I definitely am, since I'm originally from Russia and I live in Silicon Valley. A lot of people love what's happening here. I totally agree with you. A lot of them think it's, just streets are paved with term sheets.
Yeah.
It's not gold. But the question that I am asked a lot is, well, at some point, this whole big sandcastle is going to start crumbling, just as it did in the 90s.
Yeah.
And then later in mid-2000s, and this is definitely going to happen again. So a question to you, consisting of two parts. One, do you think this will happen, and if yes, when? And then the second part of that, if you could, either answer it separately or somehow intertwine those two things together, is do you feel that there are certain different things right now, really, really different from the way things were in late 90s or in 2005, 2007?
So the thing that scares me about a bubble, and I like yourself, I've lived through many bubbles, is that they always say that the fundamentals are different in every bubble. So there's always, like, I remember in the .com, they were like, well, this is a totally new paradigm. You don't need revenue. It's like, this is the internet. And then in the housing bubble, they're like, well, these derivatives are dispersed across all of these, different properties. So they're safe and it's a whole new paradigm. And now we can say the same thing about right now. There's always a reason that it's different this time. And no bubble, nobody would invest in a bubble if it was an exact copy of the previous one. And they knew it was, doomed to implode. So, there's always this talk about different. Now we always say, now we're like, oh, it's totally different than the .com because companies have real profits now and real revenue and blah, 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 blah. Let me say it is different than the .com, but that doesn't mean it's not a bubble. So it's very different. Companies do have, there are really good companies out there, but that doesn't mean that the question again is, will their revenue go away if the economy takes a dip? Not that they have revenue. Like I had a company with real revenue in the .com days. We were earning real money, unlike some other startups. But all of our revenue vanished instantly when the bubble crashed. So that is the harder question. And that is more on a case-by-case basis, because there were great companies that came out of the .com crash that managed to pull through it, that had real engagement from users, real revenue, all sorts of stuff, and actually became viable businesses. Now, not a lot proportionally, but they were there. Again, maybe if we have a downturn in the economy, we're going to see no matter what, the economy goes through bull and bear cycles. So we will hit a bear cycle for whatever reason, and it will go down, and down with it will go a lot of startups. And why I say a lot of startups, more than ever before, because there are more startups than ever before. There are tons of companies, so we'll see a huge carnage out there. Probably more startups than ever before will survive that, because there are a lot of good companies like Airbnb and others with good real revenue that have a very compelling business model and it's very hard for anybody else to catch up or copy them. So those startups will be fine. So it really comes down to which startups you place your bets on. And as a startup, so the perspective is some venture capital who has invested in risky in startups that are more sensitive to downturns will suffer more. Those who have invested in startups that can weather the storm in the long run will do better. Will it be a huge correction? I don't know. Will there be some correction? That's inevitable, right? It's going to go down, and with it, it's going to take a lot of companies. But will we bounce back? Absolutely. Technology is changing everything. We will bounce back. And just like we did from the .com, just like we did from 2009, the financial crisis, we will bounce back and we'll be bigger and better than ever. So who cares that it's going to happen? It will happen. So what? We have to focus on making smart if you're an investor, making smart investments. If you're a startup, figuring out a real business. And honestly, at this time, I think it's going to happen sooner than later. So if you're asking timing, I think it's not going to be 10 years out. I think it's going to be a few years out probably. And so if you're thinking, most startups need, many years to get to the point where they exit. So you should be planning for that. and planning a type of business that can't, especially if you're starting a startup right now, think of your business, how it will do in a down economy. And if it'll just get tanked and you need it's a long time before you're going to see an exit, it's not a quick flip, maybe that's not the best business right now.
Totally agree. Steve, really enjoying listening to you. We're going to have to, I'm going to have to ask the last question. Any great questions that you want to be asked? I have a few, but maybe you have some ideas of what I can ask you.
So you might ask me a question about, you know, the Internet of Things is really hot. And I recently heard, oh, there's an Internet of Things bubble. I'm happy to talk about that.
What do you think about this, Steve?
Well, so I think we have tons of startups, tons of corporations, huge corporations coming to us now asking for Internet of Things companies. They're like, show me an Internet of Things company. We need that, you know? So that's the flavor of the month. We all remember, you know, not too long ago when it was Bitcoin, that everybody wanted a Bitcoin startup and you know, cryptocurrency. Now there's some good plays in Bitcoin, but there was a lot of hype. So I would say bubble, no. Hype, yes. You know, we go through these hype phases when there's overinvestment in certain sectors and then it tailors off. It's kind of natural. I find it very hard to identify good consumer Internet of Things companies. So what I mean, you know, we all saw Nest. That was the first consumer Internet of Things kind of go off the charts and get acquired for billions by Google. But Google didn't acquire Nest for just Nest. They acquired it for the team's knowledge and for a gateway into the home. You know, it's their platform. They're making a platform play. Well, Google's already made their platform play. Samsung's, you know, kind of they bought Smart Things. Everybody else is making their platform play. It pretty much has made it. Who's going to be a player in there are only so many platforms we can have, and there aren't going to be too many. So most of these Internet of Things then are going to be on top of these platforms. So what is really worth consumers paying for it? And as we know with Nest, I mean, honestly, you can buy a thermostat for $10 at a hardware store. Are you going to spend hundreds of dollars on your thermostat? If you're a normal person, you're not going to do it because it's not that hard to use, right? I can use my thermostat, and you know, it's not like a VCR, right? They didn't simplify it. In fact, they made it harder to use. Nest is harder to use than than a basic thermostat that costs a fraction of the price. People bought it for bought it for vanity play, right? It's a toy, it's a gadget you can show off. Your home looks cool. You're an early adopter. You're cool. That's why they buy most of these Internet Things are cool factors right now. They aren't genuinely providing enough value to be a real business. And if you go on Kickstarter, yeah, they could do a great Kickstarter campaign because there's enough of those early adopters to fund it with $1 million or more because they're like, cool, I want it. You know, I don't care if it, you know, is really, you know, good or not. I just think it's cool and I'm willing to do it. It's a hobby. So, but to translate from a hobby into a big market is another thing. And really what I look for in the Internet of Things, consumer especially, but also in business to business, is I want to see that the software layer, which most of the Kickstarter ones lack completely. I mean, the software is very thin. It doesn't really, if at all, some of them don't, you know, it doesn't really lock the consumer in, right? Lock the consumer into a long-term relationship where the consumer is invested in that on the software side, data and time and everything else so that the switching cost is high. Because as we all know, some other company in China or Vietnam or anywhere can just copy the hardware, put it out there with that thin layer of software and undercut you in price. And you don't really have a long-term business. It's just going to spike and then go away. So you have a long-term business if you can lock the consumer in. And so that's what I see very few of. I'm looking hard for all our corporate partners for Internet of Things companies. And I'm like, you know, most of them I'm like, oh, yeah. You know, it's just not enough. It's not a $1 billion business, right? This isn't a $1 billion business. It might be at 20 million, 40, 50 million dollar business. The other thing where I see real promise in the Internet of Things, and especially long term, whether there's short term gyrations in the market or whatever, is everything's getting smarter. On the industrial side, in businesses, Internet of Things is going to be huge. Every device that can save time and money for businesses will be adopted, and it can make them more efficient. So in making everything businesses use smarter and more connected to the internet and able to gather and most importantly use the data effectively will be enormous. Now, right now, most of the data isn't being used effectively, but that will change. That it's just, I mean, it takes time. These things take time to work out. So in the long run, the effect on our economy is going to be enormous by the Internet of Things. So it's not just hype. I mean, because I include in the Internet of Things all the software layers, the artificial intelligence, the data gathering that will make everything we interact with so smart and will actually affect enormous changes in society. There'll be a huge displacement like we've never seen before, honestly, of workers. And we will, societies will have to grapple with this, you know, where knowledge, the people will have to change how they work and the value they add. Because literally, if you can imagine a factory or any sort of business, whether it's a surgery in a hospital done all by the computers, it's going to be better than doctors, right? Doctors, first of all, aren't cheap and they make mistakes. They come in, you know, they had a few too many drinks last night and they're operating on you, or they're, you know, they have, you know, whatever it is, they're just not focused. I have bad days. I have like horrible days. Whereas if I was a surgeon and had all these surgeries scheduled, God forbid, I would be operating on people. A machine won't have those, right? It'll do it exactly the same way every time, right? Accountants, our whole tax system is just based on rules. Those rules can all be done better by machines. Honestly, you know, we don't need people to prepare our taxes. They actually aren't the best at what they do. Machines will, so it's not blue collar workers, but you can imagine every restaurant will be fully automated. Cooks, like making a great 5-star meal, once you've made it once you've had somebody to dream up that meal, if all chefs are trying to do, if you actually talk to them, is get their sous chefs and all these other people that work for them to do the damn thing the same way they did it. Every time, exactly the same way, right? So if the machine will do it exactly the same way, it doesn't matter if you're Burger King or, you know, the best, you know, Michelin guide restaurant, you'll have machines doing it. And across department stores, factories, of course, you know, everything will be done by, everything that can be done by machines will be done because they don't require overtime. They don't get sick. They don't, you know, they don't sue you for sexual harassment. You know, they're not that sexy right now. We want to harass.
Although if you watch that latest movie with the sex bots, maybe they do.
Oh, okay, yeah. Someday we will be sued by machines for sexual harassment. I'm sure. You know, I'll have a crush on a machine someday, hopefully. But yeah, it's going to be enormous. So is it a bubble? It doesn't matter. If it is or it isn't, it will be huge. So the hype isn't misplaced. Sometimes the markets are a little ahead of themselves.
Enjoyed listening to you. I wish we could continue, but I so much appreciated your taking the call, your shaving your beard.
Yeah, good.
For this conversation that, ladies and gentlemen, should be especially appreciated. Not too many people shave beards just to talk to us. And
you, Igor, anything.
Here you go, ladies and gentlemen. Steve Hoffman, a serial entrepreneur, an angel investor, the captain and the co-founder of much talked about Founder Space, and a man who said no to millions of dollars.
And regretted it.
He is not ashamed to say he regrets it. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.